film, George C. Scott played the general so well that Scott won an Oscar.
Where you going, General? Berlin! I'm gonna personally shoot that paper-hanging son of a...
Patton. In real life, George S. Patton, Jr. was rolling thunder, a man who grabbed fate by the throat and made himself a winner. But, as we are about to see, Patton was playing a part he wrote for himself, behind a warrior's mask. Patton loved the roar of the crowds that welcomed him home after victory in Europe in 1945. In the Hollywood Bowl a few months before his death, he might have been speaking about himself.
At this point, I want to correct a grave illusion. You don't have to be dead to be a hero. People always talk about heroic dead. Well, goddamn it, there are a lot of heroic alive ones.
A hero. That's how the world saw Patton. A live one, a living, breathing hero. His daughter saw much more. The former Ruth Ellen Patton, now Mrs. James Taunton.
He was a very, very, very complex person. I think the closest person that ever understood him was my mother, but I don't think anybody else ever understood him. And that would have delighted him. Who wants to be understood? It takes away all your mystery.
Stripped of the mystery he loved, the real Patton is only now coming into view through his very private diaries, journals, and letters deposited in the Library of Congress by his family. Some of General Patton's later papers will not be open to the public until 1990, but Martin Blumenson has seen them all and has keys that unlock the mystery. Blumenson is author of the Patton Papers, a specialist in military history. Even he was surprised by what he found.
When I got into the Patton Papers, the diaries and the letters and the other things, I discovered, to my great surprise, that there was a private Patton hidden in those papers. The public Patton everybody knew about, this strutting, swaggering, kind of profane person who was a superb commander and a great military professional, but in those papers, there was quite a different person who was tortured, poetic, sensitive, anguished, and quite a different personality from the personality that I think he did on purpose, that he projected on purpose in order to fulfill his military image.
In these papers, the insecure boy, the frustrated poet. In these papers, the long hidden pieces we can now put together for the first time to tell the real story, the story of the poet and the warrior, of their conflict and their coming together in greatness. The story of one man who overcame insurmountable obstacles to become a hero. It wasn't easy. Patton faced a very early obstacle. As a growing boy, he had trouble learning to read, a disability we now know as dyslexia. So his parents kept him home from school, taught him themselves, reading aloud an endless diet of heroic exploits. While others engaged the reality of schoolyard give and take, Patton grew up playing war games with his cousins and dreaming of his ancestors. As long as he could remember, Patton had known his ancestors through countless stories about forebears like the uncle who died charging the cannon at Gettysburg. Confederate heroes held center stage in family stories, as his daughter recalls.
When my father was a very small boy, well, until he was quite old, he always said his prayers at his mother's knee, and back of her chair were a steel engraving of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And until he was about 15 years old, he thought that they were an engraving of God and Jesus Christ.
As a youngster, Patton had held in his hand the iron shell fragment that killed the first George Patton, a Confederate colonel. The young Patton was surrounded by Civil War mementos. He'd fondled the colonel's blood-soaked shirt.
And being an only son, I think a great deal too much was expected of him. I think from infancy, he was under tremendous pressures to be a hero.
The young dreamer meets reality face to face at West Point, 1904. Here and now, he must live up to his past. From the austerity of his cadet quarters, he writes, "Dear Papa, I have lived 19 years. I have wasted them. I amount to very little more than when I was a baby. Though I want to, I don't succeed. The sum total of me is that I am lazy, stupid, yet an ambitious dreamer who will degenerate into a third-rate second lieutenant and never command anything more than a platoon." It was a revealing letter, an insecure teenage Patton under pressure to be a hero, confessing a fear that will plague him the rest of his life, his fear of failure. If that seems surprising from a young man who would rise to four-star general, the facts are that the George Patton who graduated from West Point in 1909 had a tough time getting through. It took him 5 years instead of the usual 4. He flunked math. He couldn't spell. He broke 2 arms and wound up in the infirmary trying for the football stardom that eluded him. He pushed himself to a place on the U.S. Army team at the 1912 Olympic Games in Stockholm in the tough pentathlon, but came in 4th. And 4th place wasn't good enough for Patton, because only 1st place counts when you have to be a hero. As he wrote home in 1909, "Dear Papa and Mama, I have got to, do you understand? Got to be great. I am different from other men. I wake up at night in a cold sweat, imagining that I have lived and done nothing. Perhaps I am crazy. Oh God, could I but see 10 years. His first chance to fight his fear of failure as an Army officer comes in 1916 in Mexico. The one-time revolutionary Pancho Villa has turned bandit, makes the mistake of raiding a border town. President Woodrow Wilson orders General Blackjack Pershing of the U.S. Army to chase Villa into Mexico. It wasn't really a war at all, but the 25-year-old Lieutenant Patton, so anxious to succeed, so afraid he won't, distinguishes himself with an act of bravado. In command of 3 Dodge automobiles and 14 men, he roars into a Villista stronghold, kills 3 bandits, and wheels into camp with a dead bandit strapped to each hood, and boasts that it was the first motorized action of the U.S. Army. The Patton bravado impresses Blackjack Pershing, who is now named Commanding General of the American Expeditionary Force to Europe in World War I. Pershing takes Patton along as an aide. Patton becomes the very first officer assigned to the brand new U.S. Tank Corps. At the front, Patton savors glory, appears fearless. But he later recalled to his daughter that he was driven on by his ancestors.
German machine gun bullets were clipping the grass off the top of the hill, and he said he was getting scared to death. He said, incidentally, that any man who went into battle and said he wasn't scared was either a moron or a liar. And he said his hands were wet and his pulse was throbbing, and he was figuring out whether it was worth it or not. And he looked up and he said there was a low bank of clouds over this sort of a ridge, and he could see his ancestors, and they were all looking at him.
Patton said he could read their eyes, and they said to him, "Georgie, Georgie, you're a disappointment to us lying low down there. Just remember, lots of Pattons have been killed, but there never was one who was a coward. Patton drew courage from the vision, and so he wrote, "I got up, drew my gun, and gave commands." And of course, we won that battle. Patton's next war is in depression-riddled 1932 in a most unlikely place, the middle of Washington, D.C. The enemy is unlikely, too. Thousands of unemployed World War I veterans demanding their promised war bonus be paid to them at once when they need it most. For 2 months, they camp in Washington. Some say the Reds are involved, that it's a revolution. President Hoover calls out the Army, orders Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur to clear out the 15,000 demonstrators. One of the officers on the attack, the brash, brave George Patton, called it onerous and unfortunate duty. But he also said, "Do your full duty as you see it and damn the consequences." One more ingredient of the blood and guts reputation he would earn. Within hours, it was over. In 1939, Hitler invades Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war on Germany. America holds its peace, but President Roosevelt calls on the nation to prepare itself. Giant war games begin. And George S. Patton gets another chance to practice war, as tens of thousands of Americans are sent swarming over the rural South and Southern California. Among them, Patton's tanks. Reporters assigned to cover the maneuvers are captivated by the brash Patton, who shouts curses, drives his machines and his men past their limits, and designs his own flashy, if ridiculous, uniforms. A hard-nosed commanding officer who even finds time for fashion, creating a new uniform in a color so dark it won't show tank grease, with padded seats for rough rides, and multiple pockets for the gadgets of mechanical warfare, topped by a golden tanker's helmet for the general himself. Patton viewed his tankers as elite reincarnations of glorious knights of old, and his love of costume led him to an outlandish King Arthur outfit in a fancy dress horse show parade at Fort Myer, Virginia. And behind the mask of the chivalrous knight, Patton was perfecting a warrior mask of his own. No one who saw it would forget it, including his own daughter.
He used to stand in front of the mirror and practice that, because he was very, very handsome. Even we admitted that. He was a perfectly beautiful man. And he thought it was weak to be that handsome. So he made those, we called it Daddy's war face.
Patton himself had written that a coward dressed as a brave man will change from cowardice. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese pull their surprise. America is in World War II. The moment Patton has been practicing for is upon him, upon the man who grew up on heroic epics, the man who had trouble learning to read, but who had studied the tactics and strategies of every major battle since the Trojan War. Less than a year after Pearl Harbor, Patton is on his way to North Africa to begin the vital Allied march on Europe. George S. Patton is the man to lead the way. At 57, he is one of the oldest Army generals with a field command, but everyone commented on his youth, because Patton worked hard to overcome age by always acting boyish, the eternal juvenile, rash, impetuous, to give himself courage, and to transmit that courage to his men. And he succeeded. 72 hours after Patton's Western Task Force hits the African beach, November 8th, 1942, it's all over. Patton wins. It's America's first victory against Hitler. The Sultan of Morocco hangs a medal around Patton's neck and tells him poetically, "Lions in their dens cower at your approach." And Patton loves it. Then Patton moves on across Africa to hunt down the leading Nazi tank commander, Field Marshal Rommel, who's so cunning he is known as the Desert Fox. Patton talks about challenging Rommel to personal combat. He talks of how we could make it like the old nightly combats. The two armies could watch. I'd be in one tank, Rommel in another. I'd shoot at him, he'd shoot at me. If I killed him, I'd be the champ. If he killed me, well, he won't. Of course, it's not to be. But Patton's tanks do take on Rommel's tanks. And in a classic duel, Patton's tanks win. Next stop, Sicily. Patton commands the first American army to fight on European ground. And he makes sure America will know about it by posing for the newsreels back home. But the American hero gets an unpleasant surprise. Patton is not pleased to learn that higher headquarters have assigned the starring role to Britain's own hero, Montgomery. Patton doesn't like to be second to anyone, not even an ally. So Patton interprets his orders rather loosely, on purpose. Racing the methodical Monty to the objective, the city of Messina, and getting there first. Patton is the hero once again. But again, a complicated hero. And that complexity almost costs him his career. The crisis in character erupts at an obscure field hospital in Sicily. The general is on a routine visit to cheer up the wounded when he comes smack up against a frightened GI suffering from battle fatigue. Patton cannot feel sympathy, only anger. This side of war he cannot tolerate. It smacks of failure, cowardice, of what he fears himself. Perhaps to blot out his own fear, he slaps the soldier hard in anger. And the crack of his glove is heard all the way to Washington. The hero has fallen. Or has he? General Eisenhower desperately needs his star tank commander for the coming invasion of France. And so instead of firing Patton, to still the public outcry he expects, Ike orders his unpredictable charge to apologize to all his troops. Hard as it is for Patton, he obeys. He tells the GI he slapped that he is sorry, and he reports to Ike, "We shook hands." Then, division by division, Patton delivers 10-minute talks, mostly inspirational, but toward the end of each, he does express sincere regrets for being guilty on too many occasions, perhaps, of criticizing and loud talking. Some call it vague, but most felt the effort must have been humiliating to Patton. In any case, the scandal is overcome, and Patton's job is saved for the time he's needed most. In the wake of the D-Day invasion of the continent, Patton's tanks break through Nazi lines, overrun, and liberate most of France, and enter Germany. It seems the war is about over when Hitler springs his big surprise. December 16th, 1944. 250,000 German troops rush from their hiding places and launch a concentrated attack. It's the last-ditch Battle of the Bulge. Among the sleepy outposts the Germans quickly engulf and surround, the town of Bastogne, where they expect an early surrender. The Allied Supreme Commander calls an urgent meeting of his top generals. Patton rushes in, full of fight. It's the moment he's been waiting for. 35 years have gone by since the young West Point cadet Patton had written home, "I would be willing to live in torture, die tomorrow, if for one day I could be really great." Now Patton gets his chance. If ever there is a time for greatness, this is it. The surprise German thrust has to be stopped, or it could break through and push the Allies all the way back to the English Channel. Patton has a fantastic plan to do the job. Fantastic because it requires permission to call off the attack into Germany and to turn Patton's army of 300,000 men 90 degrees, from east to north. An almost impossible feat. Ike asked Patton, "How soon can you do it?" Patton's answer, 3 days. It seemed unbelievable. General Patton's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations was there and will never forget that moment as Patton turned to him for confirmation that the fantastic maneuver could indeed be done in 3 days. How did Paul D. Harkins react when Patton put him on the spot?
You don't say no to General Patton, you just say, "Yes, sir." That's all I said. "Yes, sir, we can do it." That's what made him so remarkable. He just went out and stood on the road and stopped units that were going in the wrong direction, turned them around. And if you'd see a colonel there, a lieutenant colonel there, he'd say, "This is your task force and you're going north." And then he'd go to the next road and do the same thing, and he turned the whole bunch around, started them shooting up. He's just a remarkable man. He did a little swearing to get it done, but at the same time, he did it.
Patton seemed to be everywhere at once, getting it done, as if sheer force of willpower was enough. And the moment he had foreseen years before in his diary at West Point had arrived. "You have done your damnedest and failed. Now you must do your damnedest and win. Remember, this is what you live for. Never stop until you gain either the top or the grave." Now, with not a thought of stopping, Patton with his men and machines complete their historic turnaround and poise for the rush to rescue the heroic Americans the Germans have besieged in Bastogne when the weather closes in. They start the attack in a blizzard. Planes can't fly, so there's no air support. Roads are slick, so the tanks can't move. Hemmed in by weather, weighed down by his own overwhelming need to win against overwhelming odds, Patton allows himself just one appeal for help. An appeal to the top, to God. He calls in the chaplain, James O'Neill, and tells him, "I want a goddamn prayer for good weather." The chaplain protests. "We don't want to pray for weather that will help us kill our fellow men." Patton makes it a direct order. "Write me a prayer for good weather." And the reluctant chaplain produces the prayer that Paul Harkins still carries.
I've carried it every day since we published the prayer. And I've used it once or twice, and it works, still works. All you have to do is rub it. And we put it out in a little thing like that.
Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee, that armed with thy power we may crush the opposition and wickedness of our enemies. God grants the petition. They call it the day the sun came out. Planes fly, supplies flow.
And it was amazing how this prayer worked. And he said, "Well, I told you the good Lord be on my side." And he called me in and said, "Call the chaplain, bring him up here." Said, I want to decorate the son of a bitch. So we got the tapping up, and he gave him a Legion of Merit.
Bastogne is relieved, and George S. Patton makes headlines as the man who turned back the Nazis. Home is a conquering hero. The general looks out over an adoring public and for one brief moment lifts his warrior's mask just enough to allow a tiny glimpse of how hard it's been for him.
God damn it, it's no fun to say to men that you love, go out and get killed. And we've had to say it. And by God, they have gone. And they have won.
The author of the Patton Papers believes this sensitivity brought Patton torment. In the words of Martin Blumenson,
George Patton was a tormented person because I think his normal or basic nature was alien to being a warrior. And he spent all his life trying to remake himself, reshape himself into the image of the warrior. Now, this one does, I believe, at a terrible personal cost. One kills oneself and one's real nature, which I think he did in order to transform himself into what he thought the proper warrior figure should be like and should look like.
Patton's daughter knew his sensitivity well.
He wrote Mother once from World War I that he was out in the moonlight looking at the dead, and you couldn't tell the German boys from the American boys. And he said he looked at these people with their faces turned up to the moon. Some of them are on the barbed wire, and he said when he thought how many times their mothers had blown their noses and changed their diapers, that he realized how horrible war was.
Behind the public Patton, then, there always stood the tender, private, only son trying to please his father. The private Patton who wrote a letter to his father after his father's death, put on his best uniform, and went to the grave to read it. A letter that shed still more light on the tenderness that went with the strutting. The letter said, "Oh, darling Papa, I never called you that in life, as both of us were too self-contained. I never did much for you, and you did all for me. But you were and are my darling. Your devoted son, George S. Patton." Patton, soldier, hero, a man afraid to show his father the depth of his love, afraid he'd let his ancestors down, a man under pressure to be famous, worthy of some great destiny. George S. Patton Jr. died not in battle as he hoped he would, but in an automobile accident in Europe in 1945, after the war had ended. His daughter recalls one of the last things he said to her mother. "I wasn't good enough."
I wasn't good enough, and she knew what he meant, that he hadn't quite made it. But I don't think even whatever he'd done, he'd never been satisfied, ever.
But the American people were satisfied and grateful. His exploits, his boldness had shortened the war. And in accomplishing that over his own self-doubts, George S. Patton Jr. became one of America's greatest soldiers, a genuine American hero.